Leo, while holding his son Ben with his weak hand, told Ben his final wish. Leo, laying weak on the bed, knew his time was near. With tears in his eyes, he held his only son Ben, who was also filled with tears in his eyes. Ben understood the situation, tears streaming down his face like a river. If only he could help, if only he had the power, his father would be with him forever. But how will Ben survive this world alone? What exactly was his father's last wish? Do well to press the subscribe button for more touching and unforgettable stories. Leo and Ben lived a simple, peaceful life on their leased farmland. Each day Leo would be the first to rise, and Ben would follow close behind, eager to join his father in the morning's quiet work. Their routine was simple, but it brought them a sense of purpose. They worked side by side, tending to the soil, planting seeds, and caring for their small crops. For Ben, these moments were everything. He admired his father's quiet strength and steady hands, the way Leo faced every day with patience, even when things were tough. Ben saw his father as strong and unbreakable, a man who could handle anything life threw his way. Leo, on his part, felt proud to teach Ben the value of hard work. He'd show Ben how to dig the soil just right, how to water the crops at the perfect time, and how to look after the plants with care and patience. To Leo, it wasn't just about farming, it was about showing Ben how to be strong, even when life wasn't easy. Though they didn't have much, Leo and Ben found happiness in their work. They didn't need fancy things to feel rich. They had the land, each other, and the satisfaction of a day's hard work. One morning, as Leo and Ben stepped into their fields, something felt wrong. The plants, which once stood tall and green, looked dull and lifeless. Leo moved closer, looking worried as he examined the leaves. They were full of holes, chewed up and brown. A pest invasion had swept through, destroying almost everything they had worked so hard to grow. Day after day, Leo and Ben tried to save what little was left. They spent hours in the field, hoping to find some plants untouched by the pests. But it was no use. In just one season, nearly all their crops were ruined. The bright fields that once promised food and income were now barren, covered only by dried, shriveled plants. Leo tried to keep his calm, not wanting Ben to see how worried he was. He put on a brave face, saying they would find a way through this. But inside, Leo felt his heart sink. This wasn't just a setback, it was a disaster. Without the crops, they had no way to make money or feed themselves. Everything they depended on was gone. One evening, as Leo was in the fields alone, he walked through the rows of dead plants, picking up a shriveled crop and holding it tightly with pain. The weight of failure pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He had promised Ben a better life, had taught him to work hard and be strong, but now he felt powerless, as if all his efforts had been for nothing. Unseen by his father, Ben stood at a distance, watching. He had never seen his father like this, so quiet, so still. In that moment, Ben sensed something he'd never felt before: fear. The strong, unshakable man he admired was standing in a field of ruined crops, looking small and defeated. It was the first time Ben truly saw his father's vulnerability, and it frightened him. With their own farmland destroyed and nothing left to harvest, Leo couldn't let Ben see him this way for long. He needed to find a solution, and fast. Finally, in his desperation, Leo decided to turn to his old friend, a fellow farmer he'd known for years. With a weary heart, Leo made his way to his friend's house, humbly asking if he might be able to borrow a small piece of land to plant a new crop. The friend listened carefully, nodding with understanding. After a quiet pause, he smiled warmly and told Leo he could use a portion of his land for as long as he needed. No conditions, no rush, just an open offer to help a friend. Leo's heart lifted. He felt a spark of hope he hadn't felt in weeks. With deep gratitude, he shook his friend's hand, promising to make the most of this second chance. He returned home to Ben with renewed energy, his eyes brighter than they had been since the pests had destroyed their crops. The next day, Leo and Ben headed to the new plot of land. Side by side, they worked tirelessly, planting seeds with careful hands and gentle hope. They talked and laughed, sharing simple stories as they planted row after row. For Ben, it was like a weight had been lifted. He saw his father's spirit returning, that strong determination shining through again. Every day, they worked from sunrise to sunset, slowly bringing life back to the soil. Ben looked up to his father with pride, feeling the warmth of hope growing with each new plant. For a while, they both allowed themselves to believe they could rise above the hardships together. As they worked under the open sky, father and son felt that bond strengthening once more, a shared promise of resilience and renewal, even in the face of their darkest days. The crops were finally starting to grow, green and full of promise. Each day, Leo and Ben could see the results of their hard work coming to life. For the first time in a long while, Leo felt hope stirring within him, and Ben felt it too. They could almost imagine a future where everything would be okay again. Then, one afternoon, as Leo and Ben were tending the crops, Leo's friend appeared, his face stern and unreadable. Leo greeted him warmly, unaware of what was coming. But his friend's expression remained cold. Without hesitation, he told Leo he needed the land back. He claimed he had personal reasons, saying it was time for Leo to leave. The words hit Leo like a storm. He felt his heart sink, confusion filling his mind. "But we had an agreement," Leo stammered, struggling to understand. "You said I could use this land for as long as I needed." The friend shook his head, his gaze turning hard. "Things have changed," he replied flatly. "I need it back, and I need you off by the end of the week." At that moment, Leo felt like the ground beneath him had vanished. All his hopes, all his plans for a new beginning were crumbling before his eyes. He couldn't lose this land, not when he and Ben had already lost so much. In desperation, Leo knelt to plead with his friend, trying to reason with him. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "We're just starting to get back on our feet. I can share the profits with you, or even pay rent. Just give us a little more time." But his friend only crossed his arms and shook his head. "I'm sorry, Leo," he said, though his face showed no real regret. "But this is my land, and I have my own plans for it now." Leo's heart broke as he realized the truth. His friend had seen his success and wanted it for himself. The kindness Leo thought he'd been offered was nothing more than a selfish favor. He had been used, given false hope, only to be abandoned when he needed help the most. As his friend walked away, Leo stood frozen, his spirit shattered. All his strength, all the determination he had to keep going, seemed to fade, leaving him empty and broken. Ben, watching from a distance, saw his father's shoulders slump, a quiet defeat settling over him. Though he didn't fully understand what had happened, he knew something inside his father had changed, and it frightened him. After losing the land, Leo was never the same. The once strong, hopeful man seemed to fade away, day by day. His face, once filled with determination, was now shadowed with bitterness and defeat. The betrayal weighed heavily on him, sinking deeper into his heart, leaving him feeling empty. Ben watched his father struggle, but didn't know how to help. Leo no longer spoke with the same warmth or strength. He rarely smiled, and even his voice had lost its familiar steadiness. Instead of offering words of comfort, he sat in silence, staring at the ground, as if the world around him had nothing left to offer. As weeks passed, Leo's health began to crumble. He grew weaker, his movements slow and heavy. His spirit, once unbreakable, seemed to have finally given up. Ben saw his father slip further and further away, watching helplessly as the man he admired became a stranger before his eyes. One evening, alone with his thoughts, Leo came to a painful decision. He believed he had failed as a father, unable to protect Ben from the harshness of the world. The shame and guilt gnawed at him, convincing him that he had become nothing but a burden. He thought of Ben's future, of the challenges he would have to face alone, and it broke his heart to think that he couldn't shield his son from those struggles. In his pain, Leo convinced himself that Ben would be better off without him, a father who could no longer provide, no longer lead, and no longer stand strong. In the quiet of the night, he made a choice, one driven by a sorrow too deep for words. He took a small bottle, one he had kept hidden, and drank the poison, letting it carry him away from the pain he could no longer bear. His final thought was for Ben, and a tear slipped down his cheek as he whispered a silent apology. Leo lay weak and fading, his breath shallow as he looked up at Ben, who sat by his side, his face full of worry and grief. The room was silent except for the faint sound of Leo's uneven breathing. He could feel the end drawing near, and the weight of his final secret pressed heavily on him. With a trembling voice, Leo looked at his son, his eyes full of sadness and regret. "Ben," he whispered, his words weak but filled with urgency. I took poison." The confession fell heavily between them, and Ben's face turned pale, his eyes widening in shock. "I couldn't keep going," Leo continued, his voice cracking with guilt. "The burdens, they were too much. I wasn't strong enough to face them." He looked away, unable to meet his son's gaze. "But my last wish, Ben, is for you to be strong. Stronger than me. Don't be a coward. Face this world, no matter how hard it gets." Ben's heart pounded, his mind racing as he tried to grasp what his father was saying. Anger and sadness surged through him, mixing into a storm of emotions he couldn't hold back. "How could you?" Ben's voice was raw, filled with pain. "How could you just leave me like this? You're telling me to be strong, but you couldn't even stay to fight beside me." Tears filled Ben's eyes as he spoke, his voice trembling with both love and bitterness. "How am I supposed to survive in a world that even you couldn't face? You're leaving me alone with nothing. If you couldn't find a way through, how am I supposed to?" Leo closed his eyes, his heart filled with guilt. He had hoped his last words would give Ben strength, but instead, he could see the hurt he'd caused. He'd left his son, not with a legacy of hope, but with a burden too heavy for any young heart to bear. In his final moments, Leo's heart ached with regret, knowing that his choice had left Ben feeling abandoned and betrayed. Ben sat there, tears streaming down his face, feeling as though the world had fallen apart, his father's last wish tainted by weakness and loss. With nothing left and no one to turn to, Ben found himself out on the streets. The home and life he had once known were now just memories, and the emptiness left by his father's death felt like a weight he could never lift. Each day became a struggle just to survive, and each night brought the same cold, lonely reminder of the life he lost. Everywhere he looked, he saw a world that felt indifferent, even cruel, a world that had taken everything from him. His father's last words haunted him, filling him with a deep, unresolved anger. He couldn't understand why his father had chosen to leave him alone, to abandon him to face the very hardships he himself couldn't endure. This anger became his shield, hardening his heart as he drifted through the streets. Day by day, the pain turned to bitterness, and any hope he might have once held on to faded away, replaced by a resolve to survive on his own terms, no matter what it took. As time passed, Ben fell into the company of others who shared his struggles, people living in the shadows, forced to fend for themselves. Survival became his only goal, and soon he found himself slipping into a world of crime, a world where anger and bitterness could be channeled into actions that brought him a twisted sense of control and power. But the life of crime only led him further down, trapping him in a cycle of violence and pain. The things he did and the choices he made all seemed to pull him deeper into a world where escape was impossible. The same anger that had driven him forward now chained him, leaving him without hope, just as his father had been in his final days. In the end, Ben's life came full circle, ending with a sentence that would confine him to a prison cell for life. There, in the cold walls of confinement, Ben's journey reached its tragic conclusion. His story had followed a dark path, one defined by betrayal, abandonment, and a legacy of despair. Just like his father, he found himself trapped with no way out. As he sat alone in his cell, Ben realized, too late, that he had become a reflection of the very fate he had resented, a life overshadowed by pain, broken by the burdens he had been left to carry. His final days became a haunting echo of his father's last moments, a bitter reminder of the despair that had defined them both. The story of Father's Last Wish is a cautionary tale about the effects of despair and abandonment on future generations. Leo's decision to give up and take his own life left his son, Ben, to struggle alone, unprepared for the harshness of the world. As a result, Ben's life spirals into anger, crime, and ultimately, a tragic end. The story teaches that when parents surrender to hardship, they risk passing that despair onto their children, who may carry the weight into their own lives. Instead, seeking help and showing resilience, even in the darkest times, provides children with the strength to do the same. Ultimately, Father's Last Wish reminds us that real resilience isn't facing struggles alone. It's seeking support, breaking cycles of trauma, and leaving behind a legacy of hope and endurance rather than abandonment and despair.
Little kitten jumping around, chasing the bright moonlight. Puppy playing happily, running in the garden so bright. Rooster crowing in the morning, waking us up to study.